faithful politics listeners and viewers. I am your political host, Will Wright, joined by the ever faithful Pastor Josh Bertram, and today we are joined by Jessica Huseman. So Jessica is a journalist from Texas who's the editorial director of Votebeat, a nonprofit newsroom and Chalkbeat spinoff, which devotes itself to election reporting. She was the lead reporter at ProPublica, Electionland project, and is a frequent guest on CNN and other places. And we are delighted to have you.
Yes, we are.
Very excited to hear.
Jessica, are you for or against cessation? The most important question of the day.
I am against.
Okay.
I think that if Texas were left to its own devices and had our own power grid that shuts down when it rains, then we might not be doing so well in the long run. But I'll let that decision rest with those smarter than me, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, kind of based on my initial research about your career and everything else, like I came across kind of an interesting fact. You're an Aquarius, right?
I am born in February. In fact, yeah.
Born February 11th. I am born February 11th as well. So.
No way, birthday twins.
Totally.
I love that.
Birthday twins. You guys look identical.
That's right, in every way.
So fun. I love
it. What's funny is I found out. So Rick Tyler, the ex-campaign manager for Ted Cruz, his birthday's on February 11th also. So every
we are.
Oh, I didn't know about Sarah Palin.
Yeah, we're in good company.
Interesting.
Man, you better call QAnon. Something's going on here.
This is it. We're part of some cabal, I think.
I know. Well,
I'm a Scorpio. Do I have to leave now?
I think so. I think those are the rules.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, I mean, we don't make the rules, but every birthday, I always send Rick Tyler a happy birthday, and he sends one back. And it's just like, I don't know the guy. Like, it's just like one day I saw that he had the same birthday as me, so I Facebook messaged him or something. I said, "Hey, so you have the same birthday as me. Happy birthday!" He's like, "Happy birthday!" So now it's this weird thing we have, this strange connection, and yeah, I don't know why I told you that story. So, anyways, So you do work. You're the editorial director at Votebeat. What does Votebeat do?
So Votebeat is, I think, a unique little newsroom. We just started, so don't hold me to anything that I say a year from now, because who knows? Maybe we'll be covering like bagels and cream cheese by then. But I think Votebeat really wanted to bring election reporting back down to the local level, because I covered elections as a national reporter for 6 years, and I loved it, and it was fun, and I enjoyed the people. But the real problem is that elections isn't really a national story. It's hard to do national investigations into elections because every state and every county has its own way of doing things. And so I felt like I was putting out information that was helpful, but not necessarily impactful or educational for voters. And so it may have helped Congress figure out things or something like that, but it certainly wasn't helping like my next door neighbor. And so what we wanted to do was do a bottom-up approach to covering elections. So we do have Votebeat National, and I am the editorial director for all of Votebeat, but we're going to be establishing local newsrooms in 8 states, and those will be entirely focused on those states. And so we're trying to be sort of an educational resource for voters so that we can write explanatory pieces on how the system works. And we're also trying to make sure that these local officials who almost never get media coverage are being held accountable for the decisions that they make. And I think that that's kind of just a better way to cover elections. And then I think the most exciting thing about all of this is very much like Chalkbeat. Votebeat's articles will be free to republish. So in some states, we'll have direct partnerships with places like the Texas Tribune or the Philadelphia Inquirer or NJ Spotlight in New Jersey. But even those articles, any local news station or national news outlet could take and put online without even asking us because they're all Creative Commons licensed. So we're really, if at the end of the day, Votebeat doesn't become like a household name, I don't really care. I would just really like election coverage to be better. And so that's kind of the thrust with which we're approaching building this new newsroom.
Yeah, hold on, Jess. I'm going to put you on the spot for a second because, in addition to Josh and I talking about our kids prior to the show, like one of the things that we had talked about was like who your local rep was. So I was just asking Josh, like, hey, what district are you in? He's like, I don't know.
That's actually a really good question. I just moved. So it's funny. I don't think that I even know, which is a really embarrassing thing for me to admit. But I know that I'm represented by Ted Cruz and John Cornyn. Is that good enough? But
that's good enough. You get a pass.
Let's see. Oh, I am represented by Eddie Bernice Johnson. She is my representative. I actually, you know what? I haven't thought about this in maybe 10 years. But when I was in college, and you can cut this out if you want, this is just a completely ridiculous story. When I was in college, I worked for this newspaper called Dallas South News, which you wouldn't know by looking at me, but was the black newspaper for Dallas. I was their political reporter for like a little while in college because my professor was like, "You're broke. Do you need a job?" And I was like, "I do need a job." And he was like, "Dallas South News would like you to cover city council meetings." And I was like, "Great. What's Dallas South News?" And so they sent me to a press conference with Eddie Bernice Johnson at this old mall in Dallas that has an event space in it. And the press situation was for like Black news in Texas. And then it was like, I was there. And so I was like, "Hi, Representative Johnson, I'm from Dallas South News." And she went, and then she was like, proceeded as if everything was totally fine and like was very professional. But like my most hilarious interaction with a politician was that moment where she was like, I'm from Dallas South News. And she was like, I don't think that's true.
It's like in the background, you can hear the record scratching, all the music stopping. People are like,
what? It was great, like being just like thrown into all of these ridiculous situations by my brilliant editor at Dallas South News was the best experience like of my college career. So I have them to thank for like just no longer being like shy at all. Just like, can I ask a question now?
Anyway. That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, it's those experiences, right, that shape us. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about the Votebeat. And I love the mission behind that. I think that's really, really cool. And thank you for doing that. And I guess a question that I have is, so when you're thinking about like covering like the voting process, like for me, I just go in, I vote, I don't even think about it. Like I used to just say, okay, I wouldn't even know what the issues were. They just hand you a card, say, "Hey, if you're a Republican, you vote this way. If you're a Democrat, you vote." Okay, there you go. Ding, 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 ding. It's like easy, like it's just a nice heuristic. With your expertise on basically our elections in this country, what really is inspiring you? Like, what issues are inspiring you to make sure that you're covering this well? And that people become educated about voting. Like, what's your big why? And with that, like, there's different reform bills happening that are being proposed. And like kind of coming off of that question, your big why, like, are there any of these bills that are giving you hope? Or are there ones that are just like not enough? Or what do you think needs to happen in terms of legislation surrounding these election questions?
So I think that I love, this is going to sound crazy, but I love the people who carry out elections, like county clerks and county registrars and like local election administrators and state elections directors are all just like the greatest people in the world. I mean, I think that I have met maybe like 5 where I'm like, you're a bad person and you're bad at your job. But the rest of them, and I've met hundreds, are like, you know, maybe they're not the greatest at what they do, but they care a lot about it and they want to be better. And, you know, county clerks and election administrators are this really interesting group of people, because if you think about it, it is one of the few government offices that people are forced to interact with on a regular basis. Like, you probably don't walk into the mayor's office. Like, you probably haven't, right? And unless you have some specific business there, but everybody has gone to a polling location. Everybody has interacted with the county clerk in some way. And so even though no one knows what that office does, that's the office that you're interacting with. Like, they're the public door to local government in like many ways. And I think that they have not gotten their due in terms of coverage for the things that they do and how important it is for the literal basic function of government. And they have been sort of serially ignored. You know, these counties have terrible cybersecurity. They have horrible physical security. The voting machines are old and broken, and they're like holding them together with these crazy like tricks. And I think that it's easy for those people to be ignored because elected officials who sit above them and give them funding are like, well, I got elected, so the system must be fine. You know what I mean? And so I think like that frustration that like this office where every citizen has to go and do things is serially ignored and underfunded is not only disrespectful to the people running that show, but to the voters themselves. And I don't even know that national and state legislatures are aware of that, like are aware of how disrespectful, seriously underfunding and like ignoring these offices is to the people who must interact with them. Because what happens is like, we make it harder for election administrators to run their offices, which in turn makes it harder for people to interact and to vote with those offices. And so I just think that this is all just very disrespectful to democracy as a whole. And I know that that's like a really philosophical answer to your question, but that's
a great
really
answer.
I think that's why I keep doing this, is because it frustrates me so much that this is the most important thing that you can do as an American citizen, and the mechanics around doing it are absolutely like, it's just lunacy. And I think that the federal legislation that is moving through Congress right now is really frustrating for me and for a lot of election administrators for a lot of different reasons. Democrats, for whatever reason, have thrown all of their eggs into the HR 1 basket, which is their massive omnibus voting bill that's almost 900 pages long at this point and deals with everything from like how the USPS should engage with like touching ballots to whether or not DC should be a state. And I think it's a bit, it doesn't make a lot of political sense to me. Like, this bill is not going to pass. Democrats are still focusing all of their attention on it, even though it is not going to pass. And that I think is just disrespectful to voters. Like, yeah, like HR 1 is in theory a good bill. Progressives love it. It is a great statement as to your priorities. But at some point we have to be realistic. And while they're messaging HR 1, elections are continuing to be poorly funded and badly regulated. And so it's just wasting everyone's time. I think that the John Lewis voting rights bill is a lot more reasonable. Joe Manchin has said that he would support it, even an expanded version of it. It would bring back at least some version of pre-clearance to the United States, which would mean that all states and local areas that pass legislation that would change voting in any way has to be pre-cleared by the DOJ before it can be enacted. That was a really crucial protection in a lot of states until 2013 when the Supreme Court struck it down. And so bringing it back, I think would be, and like bringing back a formula that determines which states and localities have to do that would be a step forward. What it does not do is fund elections. It provides this voting rights protection, but in the 6 years that I've been doing this, I can tell you that a heck of a lot more people are disenfranchised because their election is underfunded and they don't have enough polling locations, and they don't have enough good poll workers, and poll workers are badly trained and the machines don't work, than like actual literal disenfranchisement. You know what I mean? Like, it is, people are certainly disenfranchised, and I don't mean to minimize that, but I think like your average person is far more likely to be disenfranchised by a mistake made by a poll worker or lack of access to like voting resources than they are a voter ID bill or strange gerrymandering, which is what we're focusing on. But, the vast majority of small problems that impact voters in really material ways that lead to their provisional ballot being thrown out, or them showing up at the wrong polling location and the poll worker giving them bad instructions as to how to remedy that could be solved if we had consistent election funding. And so the infrastructure package is going through Congress right now. There is no election funding in there, even though under federal law, election is considered critical infrastructure. So I don't really know what the federal government is doing. And I continue to be frustrated by it.
Yeah. What's interesting, just listening to you talk, there seems to be a lot of parallels between people of faith that do proselytizing and people that try to encourage people to vote. Like, you've got a certain segment of the population that are like, I don't want to buy what you're selling because I just see how you act, Yeah. And then there's another side of like, I don't really want to vote because I just don't see it making that big of a difference, So in both cases, there's like a lack of faith and these institutions. And I'm curious, like, how do you convince somebody that that their vote really matters, especially when they look at politics, they look at the people that are being elected, and they're like, these are the people,
that I have elected.
Yeah.
It can be really hard to do. I think that one thing that I wish folks would sort of grasp onto a little bit more is that, it's kind of hard to convince someone that they should vote for President of the United States, because materially it is unlikely that voting for Trump or for whomever or for Biden or for Charlie Brown will impact you in your home like regular citizen, right? But what will impact you in your home is local government, and that'll include like whether your street gets paved appropriately, like whether or not the power lines outside of your house are like flinging up against your trees, zoning, local taxes, whatever. I think that there is a much more direct causal link between like I am voting for my local government and like this thing happens, because no one votes in local elections, especially if they are in many states held separately from federal elections. And so I think that the first step might be convincing people to think more locally. And then once you become a regular voter, because you see the impact of your engagement, then you start taking on bigger and bigger and bigger things. And the reason that I kind of came to this realization is a few years ago, I spent a few weeks in this little tiny town in Texas, which is like, tiny towns in Texas are basically like my comfort space. I grew up in one. My dad grew up in one. My whole family lives in one. And so every time like a small town in Texas becomes relevant, I'm like, I'm going, I'll be back later. But my favorite town I've ever visited truly was this town in South Texas called Cotulla. And it was the place that LBJ taught elementary school and was an elementary school principal before beginning his career in public service. And he actually mentioned Cotulla in his Voting Rights Act speech alongside Selma. But because there was not a massacre in Cotulla, understandably, it was not so historically memorable. And it turns out that LaSalle County, which is where Cotulla is, has among the lowest federal voter turnout in the country. And so I wanted to go down there and be like, all right, this is a huge historical irony. Like, how did the town that inspired LBJ's activism on the Voting Rights Act, like, just decide not to vote? And that breaks my heart a little bit. And so I went down there and I spent a couple of weeks. And what I determined was that people were voting. They just weren't voting in federal elections and state elections because they were like, we're a rural county. No politician has ever come out here. I think the only politician that had visited LaSalle County in like the previous 5 years was Will Hurd, who represented the district and like would show up at Dairy Queen sometimes. And Beto, when he was running for Senate, like did like a very small town square thing and then bounced right out. And so they were like, we're a small county. No one gives a shit about us. No one like we're very unique, and they are like rural, oil, heavily Chicano. Like it's very different from the rest of the state, and also like heavily Democrat. So everyone, even if they're a Republican, there is a registered Democrat so that they can vote in the Democratic primaries because that's where the decisions are made. And so even though I went down there to figure out like, why aren't you guys politically active? What I actually learned was that they are very politically active, just not in state and federal elections, but they all know who the like local county council is. They know who the mayor is. They talk to the mayor. Like the mayor owns a bar and they go talk to the mayor at the bar. Like that's their engagement. And I think that frankly, like that type of engagement is much more productive than the type of engagement that the media tends to, you know, tell people is most crucial, like turn out and vote for president. That is important, and I wish people would do it. But if I have to choose, then I'm going to choose county and city.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting when I think about specifically the last 4 years. You know, it seems a lot of the folks that I talk with have become more political or more engaged in kind of the political process because they're either for or against Trump and, you know, wanted to see some change or some continuity. And I was speaking with somebody recently to try to find kind of the good side about January 6th. You know, like it was just a horrible day, you know, but I mentioned to this individual that, hey, if there's one positive thing, everybody knows the date that Congress counts the votes, you know, because like if you were to ask like a random people in the street, hey, can you explain the Electoral College? Most of them would kind of look at you funny, you know, but most of them would probably say, yeah, something important goes on the 6th, you know, like, and now that day is sort of ingrained in our heads, like I somewhat feel a little bit better about, you know, our overall political knowledge about the Electoral College. And I'm curious if you think there's, you know, maybe been any good sides from not necessarily January 6th, but just overall, just in the past 4 years, you know, how people have become engaged both locally and at the national level.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So when I first started to work for ProPublica, I was actually a health reporter, like specifically on child welfare and the pharmaceutical industry, which is obviously like very different than what I'm covering now. And so the 2016 election approached and they were like, okay, you're an elections reporter now. And I was like, all right. And so I knew nothing. And like also being an election administration reporter sounded like the most boring job in the world. And then all of a sudden we got Donald Trump and it was like, oh, I'm accidentally on the most exciting beat that anyone has ever thought of. I guess I should learn something about cybersecurity. And so it's been interesting for me as somebody who's kind of like come along on that journey to watch the country like not really care at all about what voting machines they were casting their ballots on to these like full-throated, angry protests over lack of paper ballots. Like if you had told me that there would be an audit and like conspiracy theorizing that took up all of our national headlines around like whether or not there's bamboo in ballots, like I think that I probably would have laughed at you. And so, you know, I think that this, you know, these conspiracy theories though come with like actual genuine engagement that aren't from people who are not on the fringes. Like I think, you know, I have not had friends asking me until recently, like, how does vote by mail work? Or like, if I put my ballot in the mail, will the post office deliver it? Well, how are these counted? How does signature matching work? Like, these are all elements of our election system that have been there for many years, and no one knows about them. And now you just like have conversations about vote by mail at parties, or at least I do. Maybe my parties are.
That sounds like a great party.
It's a great party. So yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of odd silver lining is that people have a better appreciation for how the election system works, and I think that is crucial to fixing it. Because if there's no public buy-in for like giving more funding to local elections offices, it's just not going to happen. So, and I think there is now.
You know, I've been very enlightened in this conversation already. Like, one thing, like, you're absolutely right. If I was asked, like, hey, I want you to cover like an election administration, I feel like I would just quit.
I know. I was like, you know, like, I know I'm new here, but my bad. My job.
Yeah. Like, do you hate me? It's like, what did I do to offend you? But like, Jen seeing like how like that has become like the most like hype in like, you know, I don't know, like in the spotlight, you know, issue. It's amazing.
No, I don't think that when ProPublica gave me that beat, they were like, all right, in 4 years, CNN will pull you on as an analyst to talk about election. Like that. I don't think that I was the reporter that they thought would get a CNN contract. Like, given that, things have changed, obviously, but it's been a wild ride.
And the other people, the other reporter that got put on the infectious disease in 2017, now they're like so happy, you know. Like,
oh, I know. I mean, like Caroline Chin, who works at ProPublica and sort of like became our COVID czar. Her series of stories are being turned into a Netflix special.
Oh my gosh.
She's a health
can you even imagine?
She's fabulous. One of my favorite people. But like, can you imagine being like, I cover infectious disease and I have
hey, you're next.
special. Like,
Netflix.
Maybe, yeah, hey, Netflix, I'm here. I'm here for you.
She's here. She's ready.
I'm ready.
So, I mean, in that vein, like it's become so popular. Right. And I don't know if popular is the right word, but it's in the headlines, of course, with what former President Trump, you know, the hype he brought around it and the accusations. And I have a lot of good friends and people that I know and deeply respect that still are very skeptical. And I don't really have, you know, a strong opinion on that necessarily. Like, people have their reasons. And I don't think it was that like voter fraud was the degree, which I'm hearing people say. I tend to trust what's going on there, maybe call it naivete or whatever, but I just kind of trust it. And also, I don't want to put all the work that's required to try to figure it all out and follow every single like suit, like all the billions to us. I'm like Trump. And then he said, anyway. But, you know, I when I used to hear voter suppression, right, that's come out, like, I heard about that like that was America of the 60s or America of the 50s and before, Jim Crow, things like that. Like, when I hear voter suppression, like I remember hearing that for the first time, being like, what, wait, voter suppression? Like, I've never had an issue voting. I don't know anybody who's had an issue voting. What's going on here? And of course, my small world is not like an accurate reflection of the wider world. And I can totally acknowledge that. But I guess like when I'm asking you, what is voter suppression and is it happening? And is it being, are the Democrats, are they pushing it too much? Are the Republicans not taking it when they should as a cause? Like what's going on here?
I think a lot of things are happening at one time. I think that one, as we've discussed, in the last 4 years, voting and like the act of doing it has become politicized. And so I think that both parties have an interest in, you know, Republicans have an interest in exaggerating voter fraud because they feel like it motivates their base. And to a lesser extent, Democrats do have an interest in exaggerating claims of voter suppression because that does tend to motivate their base. I mean, like, think about the powerful energy around Stacey Abrams' movement in Georgia. Like, there were people waiting in line for 8 hours. Like, I think there is real power in saying to people, like, you're being singled out, and people react to that in very strong ways. And so that's not to say that I think that Stacey Abrams is lying and that voter suppression is not happening. I do think that there are progressives who call things voter suppression that are not voter suppression, or things that have like a negative effect, but that negative effect was never intended or thought about, and then that's called voter suppression as well. Or, you know, something inadvertent happens, like a machine breaks down, or there's like a water pipe burst in a polling location and they've got to shut it down and the lines go really long. That's not voter suppression. I think that, you know, there is a tendency to sort of like create correlation, where there is not necessarily correlation in this space. But I will say that historically, I understand why people do it, right? Like, we're coming from first of all, I think that voter suppression is absolutely happening. I don't think that you can look at the legislation that's going through Texas, parts of the legislation, certainly not all, that are going through Georgia, definitely what's happening in Florida, the audit that's happening in Arizona, like those in my mind are straight up attempts to suppress the vote. And I don't think that there's another interpretation of them. Like, there is no justification in my mind for taking an election that had no problems and then adding additional layers of security to prevent problems that didn't occur. Like, that is big government at its worst, if you ask me. And also, there's just no justification for it. Like, if there's no security problem to address and you're doing it anyway, you don't write legislation for no reason. Like,
could you give a couple examples?
Yeah, of course. So, like, for example, Florida rolled back mail-in voting. Florida has been a mail-in voting state for decades. Like, you have always been able to join a permanent absentee list in Florida and just have your ballot mailed to you. This has been the case not just during the last 4 years, not just during the last 8. Like, this is a long-running thing in Florida, and you can't do that anymore now. They've removed the permanent absentee ballot list. There's never been a problem with it. There has never been voter fraud because of that list, and now it's gone, and it just makes it harder to vote. I think that that's just flat out suppression. And I think that that's why they're doing it, because there's no reason to make it less easy for your citizens to do something if there's no problem with the system, unless you want to make it harder. And that, in my mind, is just suppression, right? Then there are things that like are out of your control, or, for example, there's always calls of voter suppression when, for example, counties go from precinct polling locations to vote centers, which tend to mean like you can come to these 7 places in the county, regardless of where you live. We'll print your ballot out there for you, hand it to you, and you can just vote wherever is convenient for you, versus like you must go to this precinct. When you move to a vote center model, you generally need fewer precincts because the vote centers tend to be bigger. They tend to be centrally located. People would prefer to go to them because they're 2 blocks from their office or down the street from their kid's school. And so you close polling locations to accommodate that. And people say, this is suppression. Like, they're closing our precincts because they don't look at the fuller context. So I think accusations of suppression and fraud happen when there's not much there. I think that the difference is that, you know, claiming suppression is not necessarily as detrimental to the system as a whole as claiming that the entire system is fraudulent. Like, I think what we are seeing on one side is people saying this is suppressive, and that is encouraging people to come to the polls and make their voices heard. And then on the flip side, you hear this is fraud, this is fraud, this is fraud, and then people don't vote. And that's exactly what happened in Georgia. Like, there is a case to be made that the Senate would be Republican right now if Trump hadn't suppressed his own voters by telling them that the system was rigged. Like, you can look at the numbers, like much fewer Republicans voted by mail in Georgia. Like, Donald Trump lost the Senate for the Republicans. And so I think that that's a detrimental thing. Like, telling people that there is fraud when there is not makes it so that like we can't have a healthy democracy. Like, the stuff that's going on in Arizona right now, like the audit that's happening there, is like, that doesn't happen in a healthy democracy. And we're not spending millions of taxpayer dollars because somebody said that Arizona was suppressive. We're spending millions of taxpayer dollars because Donald Trump perpetrated a fraud on the American public and told them the election was stolen. Like, the same party that is like, big government is bad, unnecessary spending of tax dollars is bad, like transparency always, is having a nonsensical, expensive, ridiculous, extra legal audit of their ballots. And that's absurd. It's hypocritical in like the deepest way. And so I think, you know, that's how I feel about it. Like, even if we assume that like every time someone says suppression, it's a lie, which I don't. And every time we say there's voter fraud, it's a lie. And sometimes it isn't a lie. One is far more destructive than the other.
And so like, it's interesting to hear you say how, you know, Democrats use suppression, Republicans use fraud. And I think that probably carries on to a lot more other things and topics kind of in the political sphere, like gerrymandering versus redistricting. Are those I was joking with Josh the other day at our Bible study, you know, and he mentioned something about gerrymandering, and I said, well, Democrats just call it redistricting, you know, like it's almost like in my mind it's the same thing, but is it the same thing? You know, like are there nuances, or are there differences? You know, is it just two words to describe the same situation?
Yeah, I mean, like, technically gerrymandering is redistricting. It's just like a fancy way of doing it. I think that both parties sort of manipulate the lines to their advantage, and that's been going on. Like, I mean, if you want to talk to Democrats who do this, like, go to Pennsylvania, right? If you want to talk to Republicans who do this, go to North Carolina or Texas. Geez, like Texas, holy hell. I think my favorite thing about Texas's maps is that there are these little tiny strips of districts that run from Austin all the way down to San Antonio. And they're like little tiny things, and they kind of make this little hooked shape. And Lou Doggett years ago referred to them as the fajita strip districts, and that name has just stuck. So now we have these hysterically drawn fajita strip districts in Texas. But anyway, I think that this year's redistricting cycle is going to be really interesting because the Census Bureau didn't do a great job with the 2020 census. Like, let's just leave it at that. So the results, like the final tally for the census, is delayed. And I don't think that people realize how hard it is to redistrict or how many offices it involves. Like, I think that people think about redistricting and they think, all right, well, there's an intern in the legislature and they take a big map and then they draw pencil lines and that's how it goes. Well, no, it involves like GIS mapping and some more specific like line drawing. And so the lines are drawn generally at the state level, but then they filter down through the county and local offices who actually tell you where the lines are and draw the precincts and make sure that there is, for example, a place you could actually have a polling location in a precinct before you draw the lines specifically there. I mean, in rural America, this is actually pretty, like, is there a barn in this area that we can have a polling location? Like, these are the considerations, and it takes time. And so because the census numbers are so delayed, we're just like not going to have lines for a lot longer than I think people are used to. And then those lines are going to go into court battles. Like, I don't know when our lines are going to be drawn this year. And I think that's really going to set people's teeth on edge. And we're going to see a whole nother round of accusations of suppression and fraud. And I'm not looking forward to it.
Interesting. So in the work that you do, especially with elections, like I'd imagine you have to contend with just your own personal biases, your own personal political views, and I'm curious on how you navigate that space, you know, like while trying to report on things objectively, but you know, trying to avoid, you know, any sort of perception of political, you know, leanings about your interpretation of a particular thing. And then, you know, furthermore, you know, how do you kind of balance that with just your own faith and not letting people, allow for your faith to kind of color like your reporting?
That's an interesting question. So I'm fortunate to work for a news organization that isn't so old school about sort of like objectivity, which is a thing that I don't think is real. And I think if we would all just admit that no one is objective about anything, then maybe we would arrive at the truth more quickly. But, I think Votebeat approaches covering voting from a very specific perspective, which is like, one, we think that voting is good and you should do it. And two, we think that voting should be easy to do as long as it is secure, right? And so like, if those are our two guiding principles, then that colors how we cover the news. I think I do, as part of my role as editorial director of this nonprofit, I do a lot of training for journalists who don't work for us on like, here's how election administration works. Here's what you should do to encourage participation in the voting system without coloring it from a partisan standpoint. Like, for example, I encourage newspapers to print voter registration forms into their newspaper that people can like cut out and mail in. And I always get these questions from local reporters who say, well, like, is it too political to encourage people to vote? And I think that makes me really sad, right? Because I think that if voting itself has become hugely political, sorry, hold on just a second. I'm in a strange space. I think if voting itself has become so political that we can't even encourage people to do it, then our entire point as journalists is a little bit defeated, right? Like, journalism and being a reporter is the only like specific industry mentioned in the Constitution. And and the founders felt that, hold on just a second. Sorry.
You're good.
You're good. At least they're wearing their mask.
Okay. That's true. So I am vaccinated though, so I feel a little bit invincible. Anyway, so the founders had these really strong opinions about the need for a free press, and their foundational reason for it was that, like, in order to have an informed electorate, we must have a free press. And so in my mind, the whole function of all of journalism is to educate the electorate. And we're only doing that so that those people can then go and vote. And so, like, our function as journalists is to inform them so that they can make adequate choices as citizens. And so if we believe that we have done that, then we should encourage people to vote. I don't care who it's for. Like, that's also the beauty of Votebeat, is that we cover voting as a process, and not the campaigns itself. So like, I don't care who you're voting for. And unless it's directly relevant, I'm not going to say like, this county went 75% for Trump or this county went 37% for Biden, because it doesn't matter when you get down to the mechanics of the thing. And so, that's sort of how I feel about it, is that, like, regardless of the politics of each county, regardless of whether they're rural or suburban or urban, they should have the same access to the ballot. And that ballot should be counted as efficiently as the ballot next door and as accurately as the ballot next door. And so that's kind of how I view it, which is that voting is not a political act, it's a foundational act of being a citizen. Just like serving on a jury is not a political act, or like paying your property taxes is not a political act. Like, it's just something you do because you live here. And so I think that the way that I keep my politics out of this is by, I think, like, mentally separating the act of voting from politics as a whole, and covering it as if it is sort of like an obligatory, necessary step for participation as a citizen.
Man, that makes a lot of sense. I love the idea that voting is something that is, it's like this deeply ingrained, almost like inalienable right.
Yeah.
To, like, for someone to be able to vote, well, maybe not inalienable. I don't know. I don't know, because I know you can lose your right to vote in
You
certain
can. You
cases
can
in
lose
America.
it. I think that, this is a really interesting quirk of American history, which was that certainly the founders did not believe that all people should have the right to vote, right?
Yeah, they did not. Yeah.
They did not. And the idea that states were entirely in charge of who could vote and how, like voting is not addressed in the Constitution. Like if you take a look at the Constitution does not guarantee anyone the right to vote. What it does
Right.
say is, or like it doesn't say like these people should vote. It says there are amendments that are introduced later that say, you can't take away the right to vote based on race. You can't take the right to vote away based on sex or nationality of origin or
Right.
whatever. But there's nothing that's like everyone over the age of 18 gets to vote in every election, and that's the rule. Like that's not in the Constitution. And so states have been allowed a lot of latitude for who gets to vote, when they get to vote. There was like a decade period in the 1700s where women were enfranchised in New Jersey, and so were Black men. And in Rhode Island, they were one of the last states to ratify the 15th Amendment, not because they did not want Black men to vote, because Black men had been able to vote in New Hampshire since the 1840s. They didn't want the Irish to vote. And so that was their dividing line. And so I think that there is this sort of misinterpretation in the United States that like it had always been that white male landowners could vote until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment passed, and then everyone could vote, and then the 19th Amendment passed, and then women could vote too, which is like not at all the case. States have so much latitude. White male landowners couldn't vote in some states. There were whole territories and states where non-citizens voted with regularity. Non-citizens legally voted in Arkansas until the 1920s. I mean, all of these understandings like that we have ingrained in us, like citizens vote.
Yeah.
It was only white male landowners until the 1860s, and then everybody could vote. And then what, like that is an incorrect timeline. And so I think that if we had a better appreciation for how much states have controlled that process, then our understanding of the right to vote might be a little bit different, and we might feel less like it is an automatic given thing and take advantage of it a little bit more, because there is just, there is no guarantee that in 2 years you're even going to have the right. I mean, like you probably will, and probably nothing will happen, but states do have a lot of power over this. And unless we exercise it, we might lose it.
I mean, it brings up a really like interesting topic for me, like in the sense, like, is voting is it an inalienable right? Like, should it be? Should it be something like, for instance, do we want like Nazis voting? Do we want, you know what I'm saying? And I say that extreme, like, I think all of us want everybody to be able to vote. I think if we're all honest, as long as it's not way too different than how we think, like we have an acceptable range.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's say we want, like, there's a guy who wants everyone, like they think that everyone that's not like that all women should be required to go back to the home and not be able to work again and whatever. And that's there. And then they start making this movement. And we're going to be like, yeah, they have the right to vote. Or might we want to like suppress it a little bit? Or, you know what I mean? Might we want to like, do something? It's just an interesting concept to me. And it makes me think about, our deeply held beliefs and how much they affect how we vote and even our view of voting.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think you're right.
How has that affected you? Like your deeply held beliefs, religious,
right?
Faith. I mean, we are a faithful politics. And I'm a pastor, and Will and I are both Christian, and I mean Protestant. Will wouldn't say he's an evangelical. He's an evangelical left. He's a closet evangelical leftist. But how has that affected you? Like, how does that sense drive you of your deeply held values?
Yeah. So, I was raised Catholic. In my adult life, I have begun to attend a Presbyterian church, PCUSA specifically. And I think that, I hate to like have no original thoughts on this, but his article just captured my opinion so well that I feel like I need to credit him. A former colleague of mine at ProPublica, Marshall Allen, wrote this fantastic piece a couple of years ago in 2018. And the title is From Ministry to Muckraking, the Biblical Basis for Investigative Reporting. And I think it's just like a beautiful encapsulation of how I feel about my job, which is that like I'm a big fan of the concept of like biblical truth telling, and that is really what drives me in my job. And I think that the reason that I've chosen to make this my area of focus is because it's such a foundational thing that leads people to their own sense of empowerment, becoming an active voter and taking your own steps to become active in your local government or your national government or wherever you choose to spend your time, is I think a way to encourage people to act selflessly. And so that is why I keep doing this. And I think that I feel sort of a moral sense of duty to cover a thing that I don't think other people are covering. I think people cover voter suppression. I think people cover voter fraud. I do not think that people cover how overworked the county clerk in Hamilton County, Texas is, which led her office to hire a outsourced, unqualified IT manager, and then they got hacked. Like those are things that people are not covering, but those are things that affect that entire county in really deep ways. But national news doesn't care about Hamilton County, Texas. And so because the national news is not focused on counties, they're not focused on voting. And I think that it's just a really big hole in our coverage that impacts so much of the rest of our understanding of how the United States functions. And so I think that there just needs to be someone there telling that story. And I'm happy for it to be me. It's really fun and I enjoy it. And also it means that I get to talk to these county clerks who are hilarious and wonderful.
I'm reading this book, Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumais.
Okay.
And it's a fascinating book, and we're actually going to have her on the show next week, I think. The whole premise of the book, and I'm oversimplifying it, is basically how this move of white evangelicals basically came into kind of the political arena and totally kind of reshaped conservative thought and almost birthed the Trump era.
Yeah.
And I'm curious on your thoughts about, people of faith and the political arena, and if you think that, people of faith are more politically engaged than those who aren't, and what are your thoughts on how that affects, like local, state, national policy?
Yeah, I think that religion tends to be a guiding principle in politics, not necessarily because, religious people vote more than non-religious people, but because they are by default far more organized than people who do not belong to organized religion. You know what I mean?
Interesting. Yeah.
And so I think that churches have become a political force because they have a body of people that already believe what you are saying, feel like they are part of something bigger than themselves. And I don't mean to say that they're being like pushed to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. I think that they have found their group of people. They have found a leader who they respect and appreciate and believe. And I think it's more about like moving in that group, feeling included in that group, and having that group sort of like common ethos be that these issues are important to us. And so we need to go vote on these issues, which is why abortion has become such a big thing, or, school desegregation has become such a big thing. Voting on Sundays is a racially motivated thing because Black churches do souls to the poll on Sundays. And I don't think it's because we're religious and so we vote. It's like we're religious and so we have these common political motivations, and so we need to go to the polls and act on those motivations. And so I don't think that it's necessarily religion that is motivating these people. I think that it is that they, because they are religion, have these deeply held foundational beliefs that I think other people may not. I think that depending on who you ask, they have a really strong feeling about abortion or they don't. Like, I think that there are people out there that like most people out there, if you ask them about their deeply held opinion on some foundational issue that maybe you or I think that you should have an incredibly defined opinion about, they're just sort of like, I don't know. And I think that that's the difference. I think churches they're great at getting people spun up to do service acts that, you wouldn't necessarily do if you weren't part of our church. And they spin people up and go show up to protest whatever, because they want to participate as a group. And so I think that that's really what it's more about. But I have been concerned about sort of the perhaps not as like biblically sound religious movements that were very active in the Trump administration in a way that I felt was inappropriate. And so I think, I have a lot of mixed feelings about that.
Yeah, same here. That makes a lot of sense. And, for our last question, so we have a lot of different listeners that span the political spectrum. They span the religious spectrum. We have atheists that listen. We have very, very, very staunch evangelicals that listen, Muslims that listen, people in different, just a wide variety of people, which we're very thankful for. We didn't know what was going to happen, and we're very thankful for that. And we try to be very open to those voices on this show. But what do you think is the most important thing that you would want to say to our audience coming into these, the midterms coming up next year, and the just the political malaise it feels like we're in right now? What would you want to say to our listeners? Kind of the most important thing you think you'd want to impart?
I think that one of the most important things that I don't think that people do enough of, and maybe I'm just going to sound like a cheesy advocate of voting, but like, go be a poll worker. Like that is what I would like you to do, is to be a poll worker. And I say that because, my mother, whom I love and has given me a fabulous moral upbringing or whatever. Like, I have nothing but absolute respect for my mother. Trump voter. I don't think she was like one of those people who thought that the whole election was stolen, but she had prior to this election, she had some serious reservations about election security, et cetera. And then her employer was like, our service thing for the fall is that everybody's going to go be a poll worker. Like, if you want to sign up to be a poll worker. And my mom was like, I guess I'll do it. And she didn't actually end up being a poll worker because there were too many in Dallas County and she didn't get called, which is a great problem to have. But she did go to poll worker training. And she left and she called me and she was like, Jessica, I had no idea how secure voting was. And I was like, trying to tell you that for years, Mom. And so I think that go, even if you don't end up being a poll worker, go to poll worker training, go visit your county clerk's office, because almost every county clerk's office that I've been to has the polling, the voting machines or sample ballots that you will be casting your vote on sitting right there. Like, if you have questions about how the system works, from a security standpoint or from a voter suppression standpoint, and I don't care, whatever those questions are, you will be shocked by how open and educational a visit or a phone call to the county clerk's office would be. They will invite you to the office. They will show you the machines. They will show you how they're counted. They have set these offices up to essentially be these wonderful like museums of voting, so that if someone comes in with a question, they can easily answer it. My favorite county clerk's office in the country, and I have visited hundreds, is the San Diego County Clerk's Office in California. It's this long hallway, and every step of the ballot collection, like mailing, collection, counting process, is they're all in different rooms on the same hallway, and all of the rooms have one glass wall. And there are signs explaining each of the steps and like the history of voting in San Diego. Like it's literally like a museum of voting, and you can go in there and see it. And so your county may not be that comprehensive, but they are, I guarantee you, as welcoming. So be a poll worker. If you don't want to be a poll worker and you just have questions, go to poll worker training anyway, or at least show up at your county office and ask those questions to the county clerk, and trust that they are going to be telling you the truth. Because again, I spend all day long talking to county clerks. I've talked to hundreds of them in the last 6 years, and there are very few that I believe to be not very good at their jobs. And so you should assume that yours is. You should go ask the questions, and I hope that you're satisfied with the answers. But that is crucial.
Wow, that's awesome. So Jessica, how can people get connected with Votebeat if they want to support the work that you guys are doing, learn a little bit more? Like where can they go?
Thank you for asking me that. They can go to votebeat.org. We are actually going to be having a really fun event in which I have 3 political scientists do a game show about voting with whoever wants to join on the 29th of June. So they can sign up for that. We are a new newsroom spinning up. We will be hiring all of our reporters in the next couple of months. But for now, we do have a weekly newsletter about voting that you should sign up for. It's very fun. And in addition to fabulous voting news, features a hobbyist. So I feature one election administrator who has a strange or interesting hobby. So we have had a surfboard maker in Kentucky, several members of bands who have albums, a quilter. It's very fun. A competitive mountain biker. Election administrators are fascinating. So sign up for our newsletter and participate.
Awesome. No, that's great. Yeah. So you heard it here, folks. Make sure you sign up, participate, donate, right? Also,
please donate to us. There's a big old link, and we can expand as fast as you guys donate. So you just get out your credit card.
Yes, that's right. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for spending some time with us. We really appreciate you having here. Us. Hold on. Let me get my words straight. We really appreciate you being here with us.
Yes.
and educating us on
with us.
Yeah, you having with us.
I love it. Religion and politics are things you shouldn't talk about, but are my 2 favorite things to talk about.
Yes,
so
absolutely. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks listeners. And we will see you guys all next week. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.